Um, Again, I have to begin by saying the limud is Leilu Nishmat Avi Mori Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruben Halevi Imi Merati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And
Okay.
we're reaching the end of the era of the Avot. We're reading Shabbat this week. Will be Parshat Vayechi. And Vayechi I've always found it very interesting that the two parashot in the Torah that have the word Chaim in them, Vayechi and Chaye Sarah, are the two parashot where we seem to read about death and burial, more so than any other parashot. Chaye Sarah, of course, we read about the purchase of Marat Hamachpela by Avram Avinu, the burial of Sarah. Ultimately, the end of Parshat Chaye Sarah, we read about the death of Avram Avinu and his burial in Marat Hamachpela. And in this week's Parsha of Vayechi, we read about Yaakov's death and his burial, and Yosef's death and his request to be buried. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time tonight focusing on the whole concept of burial, the concept of Merat Hamachpelah, and specifically burial in Eretz Yisrael, because that seemed to be very much on Yaakov Avinu's mind as we go through this parsha. And as I've been doing for the last couple of weeks, I'm going to now go to my psukim here and share my screen so that everybody can see all these psukim that we're referring to. Now I got to figure out, and whenever I do this, my screen goes crazy and I can't figure out where anything is because everything is all in a different place all of a sudden. Okay, here we go. Can everybody see my screen, and which begins with Breshit Perak Mem Zayin? Okay. Um, at the beginning of this week's parsha, and for the first pasuk that we read tells that Yaakov lives in Mitzrayim for 17 years, and then it says, "Vayikrevu Yemei Yisrael Lamut," that Yaakov realizes that he is getting old and it's time for he's moving on. And he calls Yosef, and we know the story. He says, "Please don't bury me in Mitzrayim, and that when I die, please take me from Mitzrayim ukvartani bikfuratam and bury me in their burial place." Again, there's no mention of where that burial is to be. It just says, "Take me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place, their burial place." Yosef says, "Okay," and Yaakov is not content for Yosef to just say, "Okay." He asks him to swear that he'll do it, and he does. And finally, Yaakov is happy. The next story that the Torah relates is Yaakov gets ill. Yosef comes to visit him with his sons, and seemingly in the middle of a whole dialogue with his Yaakov and Yosef's son, Yaakov interjects this pasuk Zion in Parak Memchet, which is the next citation here, and says, "Oh, by the way, Avani bavoimi padan meta alai Rachel be'eretz Canaan baderech be'od kivrat eretz lavo Ephrata v'ek bereah sham baderech Ephrat hi beit lachem." That Rachel, your mother, who died on the way, on the journey, is not buried in Marat HaMachpelah, by the way. She's buried in Derech Ephrat, which is Beit Lechem. Um, this pasuk, by the way, if you read it in its context, is totally out of context. It seems as though it's inserted there from somewhere else, but it the and Rashi and the commentaries try to understand why that pasuk is placed there, because it's totally out of place. But I think, and perhaps I don't remember where I saw this and who suggested it. Says it's not my original suggestion. I saw it somewhere, but I can't remember who the source was. Says that Yaakov mentions this to Yosef in front of his sons, since his sons never knew their grandmother, and Yosef, who was 17, who was a young child when she was buried, and 17 when he left Eretz Yisrael, might have not remembered where it was that Yaakov wants to make sure that this legacy is passed on of where Rachel is buried, is passed on by Yosef to his children, so that they will be aware of where their grandmother is buried. being that it's not in Marat Hamachpela, Rachel is the only one of the matriarchs and patriarchs who is not buried in Marat Hamachpela. And as such, Yaakov wanted to make sure that this information was passed on to future generations. Yaakov already realizes after 17 years that this is the beginning of the exile, that the exile is already underway, and wants to make sure that over the next couple of hundred years, this information is not um, forgotten. And um, as such, he wants to make certain that this information is carried on to the next generation. Good evening, Harold. Thank you for joining.
Good
Uh,
evening.
Okay. So again, as I said, this pasuk, many of the Mepharshim struggle with it, why it's there, why it's totally out of place. And I think, as I said, the reason is just so that Yaakov wants to make sure that the information about where Rachel is buried is moved on to the next generation. Again, I think one of the focal points of Yaakov's legacy that we see in this week's parasha, and we clearly see that it gets passed on to Yosef, is the importance to the Jewish people of the avot, of recognizing that Eretz Yisrael is our home, and that's where we live, and that's where when we die we are buried. That seems to be a recurring theme both at the beginning of the parsha where Yaakov is speaking to Yosef, in the middle of the parsha where he's speaking to Yosef, and then at the end of the parsha in Perek Memtet, where Yaakov is now speaking to all of his sons. He's just given each one of them an individual bracha. And then it says, Vayitzav otam. I mean, now in the last bottom of the page here, in Bereshit Perek Memtet, Pasuk Chavtet, where Yaakov now tells all of the brothers gathered together around his bedside as he's giving them his final um, sava'ah, his final instructions. He says the following. Yomer Alehem, he says to all of his sons gathered around, Ani nesaf el ami, I am going the way of the world. Kivra oti el avotai, make sure that I am buried with my ancestors, my fathers. El Hame'ara Asher B'Stefer Nachiti. Now remember, when he was speaking to Yosef at the beginning of the parsha, it was simply Ukvartani B'Kvuratam. There was no mention, no delineation of where that is, what it is, who it is, why it is. And clearly, from Yosef's perspective, there is no way that we would have any idea, that Yosef would have any idea of where that might be. Yosef was not there when Yitzchak died. Yosef was not there when Avraham and Sarah were buried, although he may have, visited this Ma'ara. But we don't know that Yosef was ever had, certainly had never been at a funeral there. So, and if we think about how we as individuals pass down landmarks to the next generation, often we do that by a visit. And clearly, Yosef, at least there's nowhere that we would have any reason to assume that Yosef had ever been to Avraham's burial place. And clearly, Yitzchak was still alive throughout the time that Yosef was living in Eretz Yisrael. So perhaps that is why when he's talking to Yosef alone, he just says Ukvartani Bikvuratam. He doesn't mention what it is. Yet later, when he's talking to everyone, he now says, he gives all of the pratim in Pasuk Chavtet, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, and Pasuk Lamed Bet. We have a long discussion of by Yaakov to his sons of all of the information about Marat Hamachpela. And it's spelled out in rather great detail. The Torah records all of this because of the importance of Marat Hamachpela as kever avot to Am Yisrael as they're about to begin, or they are in the process of or in the beginning, in the early stages of what is going to become Galut Mitzrayim. Yaakov also, as Rashi comments earlier on, and when he's speaking to Yosef, does not wish to be buried in Egypt even temporarily. He wants to be immediately brought to Eretz Yisrael. Reason being, Rashi brings down a number of different reasons, foremost among them being that Yaakov was very much concerned that the Egyptians were going to turn his grave into an idolatrous shrine, and wanted to make sure that that did not happen. And the only way he could make sure that did not happen was by making sure that he wasn't buried in Egypt. And that is why he goes to so much detail with Yosef, or not detail, I take it back, so much for pressure on Yosef to ensure that Yosef will carry out his wishes after his death. And then again, all of the detail when he is commanding all of the sons exactly where they have to bury him. Again, the whole concept here of Ma'arat HaMachpelah as the landmark. I think it is the single connection for many of the Jews when they go into exile. The single connection back to Eretz Yisrael is the fact that that's where our roots are, and we know our roots are there because of the people who are buried there who are no longer living. Because if we live at a time where the entire Jewish people are living outside of Eretz Yisrael, i.e., the Egyptian exile, if we're living during the Egyptian exile, we have no connection back to Eretz Yisrael other than this singular place called Marat HaMachpelah. Because every Jew, other than those buried in Marat HaMachpelah, with again the exception of Rachel, is living in Egypt and is going to die in Egypt and is going to be buried in Egypt. And so the only connection we have back is through Marat HaMachpelah. This is why Yaakov spends so much effort and so much verbiage to his sons on his deathbed to ensure this understanding. And this focal point is really, I think, the theme of Yaakov's farewell to his sons. As I said, clearly Yaakov gives each one an individual bracha relating to either the uh, tribe and its history as a prophetic. There were a whole bunch of different commentaries as to exactly what all of the brachot that Yaakov gives to his different sons in this parsha are. But his collective message to the sons gathered around him is very, very simple. Don't ever think that you're Egyptians. You may be living here. You may have children born here who will grow up here. You may have descendants who spend their entire life here. Never consider yourselves Egyptians. Always remember that your home is not Egypt. And that lesson has to be remain with us wherever the Jewish people go when we're not in Eretz Yisrael. And I think that's the key lesson of Yaakov's tzava'ah. Again, the second lesson is a much more direct message to his sons themselves to make sure that they understand exactly what his command is. So he goes through a long discussion about Marat HaMachpelah. Kiver oti el avotai el hamara asher b'stei Ephron hachiti. First, he says the cave that's in the field that belonged to Ephron hachiti. And the commentaries tell us that Yaakov goes through all of this Peirut because he is trying to subtly address all of the problems that might crop up on the way to burying him there. There are a number of parties who may dispute the title of Yaakov, the right of Yaakov to be buried there. First and foremost, are the descendants of Ephron Hachiti who could say, hey, this is our field. You stole it from us. You have no right to be buried here. It could be the Chitim themselves who are the Bnei Chet who originally were the owners of the entire region to ensure that, again, Yaakov is going through all of the procedures here because he wants to ensure that there will be no problem. Just like when we write a contract, we spell everything out. Goes back to exactly what we read about Marat HaMachpelah. If we go back to previous references to Marat HaMachpelah, we find very, very similar wording. The first time we read about hamachpela, I'm going back now to parshat Chaye Sarah, where Avram buys the field to begin with. And it's only after he's bought the field, the Acharechein, Kavar Varmetzarish told him, Ratzde Amachpela Pnei Mamrehi Chevron, Be Eretz Canaan. Again, the Torah gives us a rather detailed description of where Ma'arat HaMachpelah is. It's the Ma'ara, it's a cave that's in Sidei HaMachpelah, the field of the Machpelah, which is near Mamre, which is Chevron, in the land of Canaan. So we have a large descriptive body here immediately after Avram makes the purchase, giving us all of the landmarks, all of the delineation of the property, such as we would expect to find in a legal contract. Similarly, we have the same thing when Avram dies. We now am in the second quote here on this page, Bereshit Perek Chav Hey, the end of Parshat Chaye Sarah. When Avram dies, we have a very similar language. Vayikperu Oto, Avram is buried by Yitzchak and Yishmael, his sons. Again, El Mi'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah. El Sidei Ephron ben Sochar Achiti Ashapnei Mamre, the field that belonged to Ephron ben Tzochar, the son of Tzochar the Hittite, which is again near Mamre, which is Hebron, as we saw in the previous pasuk that we quoted. And again, what is this field? This is the field Asadeh Asher Konav Ramei Bechet. He didn't buy only the cave; he bought the entire field, including the cave, and he bought it from Bnei Chet, Shama Kuba Avraham and Sarah Ishto, and that's where they buried Avraham and Sarah. Now, interestingly enough, the next person to be buried in Marat HaMachpelah after Avraham and Sarah is Rivka. There is no mention in the Torah of the death of Rivka, the burial of Rivka, other than Yaakov's reference here at the end of Parshat Vayechi, Shama kavru et Yitzchak v'et Rivka ishto. That's the only way we know from the Torah that Rivka is buried there. When Rivka dies and is buried, no mention is made of Rivka. Rashi in Parshat Vayishlach tells us that the reason that there's no mention of the burial of the death and the burial of Rivka is because Yaakov was not home when Rivka died. Yitzchak was already homebound because of his because of his blindness, and therefore the only one who attended her burial was Esav. Torah did not want to mention it because the people didn't want to mention, oh yeah, Esav, this person who was not necessarily seen as the most righteous individual was the only one there to attend to her funeral. And that's why Rashi seems to imply that Rivka's death is not mentioned in the Torah, neither is her burial, only, as I said, after the fact by Yaakov on his deathbed. And again, similarly, after when Yitzchak dies, again here we are in Vayishlach, when Yitzchak, it talks about Yitzchak's death, it does not tell us where he is buried. It just says Vayikbru Oto Esav Yaakov Banav. We do not have any mention of Marat HaMachpelah, any mention of the legal process through which Avram obtained it. Any of the particulars of the Ma'ara are not listed here. And again, I suspect that the reason is because at this point in time, when Yitzchak dies, with the exception of Yosef, the entire Jewish people are living in Eretz Yisrael. There is no need for this emphasis on the borders, the boundaries, the title, all of this information about Marat HaMachpelah is not need to be stressed here. When Yitzchak dies and is buried, and therefore it just says he is buried. It's only now when Yaakov is about to die and be buried there that suddenly, with none of the Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael, this whole stream of information becomes very important. And that's why, as I say, the Torah spends all of this ink recording Yaakov's words about Ma'arat HaMachpelah. And ultimately, if we go to Perek Nun, it says, what did they do? Vayisu oto b'navar Kanan, vayikbru oto b'amarat sdei HaMachpelah. And here again, it doesn't give all of the details about where it is, but it just says, Asher kana Avram et hasadeh lachuzat kever. That Avram specifically bought the field to be used as a burial plot. Again, the importance of the fact that it was not bought to be used for commercial or any other use. It was bought specifically to be used as a burial plot, as Yaakov had mentioned previously in Pasuk Lamed that I have up here, that Avram specifically brought the field. So in other words, Yaakov, as I said, in this passage here of Psukim Chavtet, Lamed, Lamed Aleph, and Lamed Bet, is trying to address any potential question, any potential lawsuit that could be brought against the right of the sons to bury him there. He addresses the ownership of the land. He addresses the zoning of the land. He addresses the borders of the land. All of that is specifically and explicitly addressed, so that when the sons get there, there will be no problems, no legal hassles about burying Yaakov there. The Medrash seems to imply that there were. Esav comes and questions it, and there's a whole midrash about how Yaakov's sons were able to prove that it was Yaakov's right to be buried there, not Esav's. Again, I think that's again, it's a nice midrash, but clearly Yaakov, by giving all of these instructions, has already laid the groundwork for this piece of property being a Jewish piece of property. And I think it's interesting as we go through Jewish history, in terms of Jewish continuity in the Holy Land. Hebron is one of the places where Jewish continuity from the time of Yoshua, once the Jews return under Yoshua, Hebron has a Jewish community virtually throughout all of history, of recorded history from that time forward. There is always some Jewish presence at Hebron, because of its eternal connection to the Avot. And I think that's, again, if we go back to the Sefer of Bereshit as a whole, and specifically to this week's parsha, the clear lesson, it's interesting because this is the only book of the Torah where the Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. The remaining Torah, the remaining 4 books of the Torah, the Jews are not in Eretz Yisrael. It's interesting that, as I say, the Sefer Bereshit is the foundation of Am Yisrael, the formation of Am Yisrael, and that foundation and formation happens in Eretz Yisrael. And Yaakov wants to ensure that we, the Jewish people, wherever we find ourselves on this globe, never forget that Eretz Yisrael is our home. And when we do forget, we forget that at the peril of our existence, of our retention of our Judaism, of our retention of our national identity. And so we are privileged to live in a time where, Baruch Hashem, we can live in Eretz Yisrael. And we need to make sure, we need to teach all of the Jewish people who are not yet living in Eretz Yisrael why it's important that the Jewish people live in Eretz Yisrael. That is the legacy of the Avot, specifically, as I say, the legacy of Yaakov Avinu and Yosef also on his deathbed at the end of the parsha, telling people, I know you can't do like I did for Abba and bring him back because you won't get the permission from Paro, but when you do leave, make sure I'm taken back home. And ultimately, as we know, Yosef does get brought back to Eretz Yisrael and is buried in Eretz Yisrael. And that commitment to retaining Eretz Yisrael in our hearts, in our minds, in our foremost thoughts should be critical for every Jew in every generation. And we hope and pray that Hashem will allow us to learn that lesson and allow us to teach that lesson to those who have not yet learned it, so that ultimately we can get all of the Jews, all of Am Yisrael back home, and we can be Zocheh to Gula Shlema b'mheira v'yameinu. Amen. At this point, I open up to questions and comments.